Hello everyone, and thank you so much for joining me today. Today I'll be talking about my dissertation project, which explores the use of bibliotherapy with modernised Shakespearean literature to enhance emotional intelligence and well-being in adults. So the main aim of my study was to explore whether bibliotherapy using modernised Shakespearean stories could help improve emotional intelligence and well-being in adults. So I was really interested in whether a short and structured programme could spark emotional reflection and psychological growth, even if the time frame was limited. So there were also two research gaps that I wanted to address. One was the lack of bibliotherapy studies involving adults, and the other was the underuse of emotionally complex literature like Shakespeare in therapeutic settings. So from this, I developed three hypotheses: that emotional intelligence and well-being would increase after the intervention, and that emotional intelligence would be positively linked to well-being at both time points. So we know that mental health services are under some serious pressure, with long waiting lists meaning that many people can't access timely support. This can leave people feeling overlooked, and research shows that these delays can negatively affect mental health and even physical health. So because of this, there's a growing interest in low cost and accessible ways to support people emotionally while they wait for formal therapy. One potential option is, or could be, bibliotherapy, which isn't just reading for pleasure, but a guided, structured method using literature to help people reflect emotionally and build insight. It's been shown to help with empathy, emotional regulation, and reducing feelings of isolation. But most studies so far have focused on children, or using self-help books, or general fiction. There's hardly any research using emotionally rich texts like Shakespeare with adults. So this study set out to explore whether these types of texts could deepen the emotional impact of bibliotherapy and serve as a short-term and useful intervention. So this study was guided by three key frameworks. The first was Morotsky's model of bibliotherapy, which describes three emotional stages: identification, where readers connect with a fictional character's situation and feel understood; catharsis, where they release emotions through a fictional character's journey; and insight, where they learn something new about themselves through a reflection on the story. Second, we used Mayer and Solovoy's model of emotional intelligence, which breaks down emotional intelligence into four abilities: perceiving emotions, using emotions to support thinking, understanding emotions and how they change, and finally, managing emotions effectively. So these are skills that can be developed, especially through reflective and emotionally immersive experiences. So they really aligned well with what the intervention was trying to do. Finally, we drew on narrative therapy and the empathy theory, which both suggest that people can safely explore difficult emotions by connecting with fictional characters instead of having to speak about themselves and their problems directly. So the intervention ran for 2 weeks and included 4 one-hour sessions. Each session focused on one branch of emotional intelligence. So Group A attended in week 1 and Group B in week 2. Each session followed the same structure. We read a modernised Shakespeare story together. Participants then reread it silently, and then we had a group discussion followed by reflective prompts. Each story matched a specific emotional intelligence skill, like Cybele for perceiving emotions or The Winter's Tale for using emotions. These plays were chosen because they deal with really human issues, for example, betrayal, grief, identity, and resilience, which many people can relate to. The idea was that by engaging with emotionally rich stories in a safe, structured way, people might begin the emotional processing that bibliotherapy is designed to do. So we used a mixed design with both within and between subject elements. 34 Bangor University students took part. They were randomly split into two groups based on their availability. Everyone took part in the same intervention, but just in different weeks. So we used a 2x2 design to allow us to compare change over time, and a between groups measure to see whether the intervention made a difference. So before the sessions, participants gave informed consent and then completed demographic questionnaires. So they filled out two pre-intervention questionnaires. So the first was the SHOOT Emotional Intelligence Test, which is a reliable 33-item scale that matches up quite well with the Mayer and Solovoy's emotional intelligence model that we discussed earlier. The second was the Warwick-Edinburgh mental wellbeing scale, which measures positive indicators like optimism and resilience, for example. So after the 4 sessions, participants then completed both of these measures again, and all responses were anonymised. Ethical approval came from Bangor University School of Psychology, and we made sure that we followed the BPS and BACP guidelines throughout, particularly around boundaries given the crossover between being, a researcher and then a trainee counsellor. We didn't want to breach any of the wrong boundaries there. So in terms of the results then, first we saw an increase in the wellbeing scores from pre to post. This wasn't statistically significant, but it did come really close to the threshold. So there was possibly a mild positive effect. Emotional intelligence scores also slightly increased, but the change was smaller and it wasn't statistically significant. So overall, no statistical significance on this front. That said, though, we did find a strong and consistent correlation between emotional intelligence and well-being. So people with higher emotional intelligence consistently reported better well-being, both before and after the intervention. We also looked at whether having a mental health diagnosis affected the scores. Those with a diagnosis also had a lower emotional intelligence level overall, which was statistically significant, but both groups changed in similar ways. And finally, qualitative feedback suggested that the sessions were emotionally meaningful, even if the data didn't capture the big changes that tells us something important was still happening. So feedback from participants actually really helped to bring our insignificant numbers to life. So some participants said that the sessions felt like group therapy, while others described them as a calming or a safe space. One said they gained better understanding of others' emotions, especially from being able to hear people's different perspectives. So even though the scores didn't shift dramatically, the emotional experience did seem to matter to people, and it did suggest that literature can genuinely help people reflect and connect emotionally. So my first interpretation of this data was that emotional growth may actually begin before it's measurable. So while emotional intelligence scores didn't increase significantly, qualitative feedback did suggest that participants experienced early emotional awareness, empathy, and self-reflection. So this supports the idea that was originally proposed by Morosky and Mayer and Solovoy, that emotional development is a staged process, beginning with awareness and insight before more advanced skills like regulation takes hold. So it could be possible that the intervention initiated emotional change, but more time may be needed before that growth becomes statistically visible. My second interpretation is that bibliotherapy can offer therapeutic value even without statistically significant change. So, participants describe sessions as therapeutic, calming, and a safe space for emotional reflection. Feedback that actually echoes findings from Billington and colleagues done in 2010, who showed that group bibliotherapy fosters emotional connection and can reduce isolation. These qualitative responses suggest that the intervention helped support emotional insight and interpersonal sensitivity, which are early markers of emotional intelligence. So, while the data didn't reflect dramatic shifts, the lived experiences of the participants reinforce the idea that bibliotherapy may act as a starting point for longer term emotional development, especially in low intensity and time limited formats. So, my third interpretation is that modernised Shakespearean narratives added emotional richness to the intervention. So, plays like Cymbeline and The Winter's Tale explore themes like betrayal, grief, and identity. And research shows that emotionally layered literature can promote empathy and self awareness through narrative immersion. So, when participants connect personally with these themes, it may appear to enhance the emotional impact of bibliotherapy, offering deeper insight than general fiction. And then my fourth interpretation highlights the strong and consistent link between emotional intelligence and well-being. So across both time points, participants with higher EI also reported higher levels of well-being, a relationship that remained stable throughout the study. So this supports previous research suggesting that EI plays a key role in managing emotions, building resilience, and maintaining psychological health. So while emotional intelligence itself didn't change significantly, its predictive power reinforces the value of targeting emotional intelligence to support mental well-being, especially in preventative or early stage interventions. So then if we move on to the limitations, one key limitation could be the role of individual differences in how participants engaged with the intervention. So, things like emotional intelligence and well-being are complex traits that are shaped by factors like personal experience, emotional readiness, and narrative engagement styles. So, some participants may have found strong emotional resonance with Shakespearean themes, while others may have felt more detached. This variability likely influenced the depth of reflection and the potential emotional impact. So, as researchers like Pardek and Heath suggest, bibliotherapy is most effective when the material aligns with a person's emotional stage or needs, meaning a one size fits all approach may limit its overall impact. A second limitation was the short duration of the intervention, just 4 1 hour sessions over 2 weeks. While this kind of brief format has been effective in the past and has been shown to be practical, low cost, and have emotional benefits, it may still not allow enough time for deeper and measurable changes in emotional intelligence. That's because emotional intelligence tends to develop gradually through repeated self reflection and practice. So, even if some early emotional processing began, a longer follow up intervention might be needed to fully support lasting growth. So, while participants did show early signs of insight, a longer or more phased intervention may be needed to produce statistically significant improvements. So, looking ahead then, future research could explore longer term or multi phase bibliotherapy interventions, giving participants more time to process and develop emotional skills. It would be valuable to investigate how individual traits like baseline emotional intelligence, reflective style, or narrative preference could affect the outcomes. So, tailoring interventions to the factors could improve their effectiveness. Again, comparing different types of literature, such as classical versus contemporary narratives, could also help determine what kinds of texts could build on emotional growth. And finally, adding follow-up measures would help assess whether the emotional gains observed continue to strengthen over time, giving us a better picture of bibliotherapy's lasting impact. So thank you so much for listening, everybody, and please don't hesitate to ask any questions.